extremists on each side sabotage the best laid plans of the moderates. Both sides are dominated by one-staters. The Israeli extremists don't see any place for a Palestinian state in the land between the river and the sea. And Hamas and its supporters don't see any place for Israel or Jews in the land between the river and the sea.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today on the podcast, we have Stephen Cook. Stephen is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Stephen is my favorite kind of guest. He bridges the world of applied work with theoretical work. He's written widely on the Middle East. His recent book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East, is one of the very best things I've read on Middle East policy. We get into historical questions in the Middle East, what went wrong with our efforts to negotiate a two-state solution. We talk about the current conflict and what we might do differently, and the role of third parties like China and Russia in the Middle East and what we should be worried about. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
It's so timely. The Middle East is always in conflict, and I think the only good news I can think of today going on in the Middle East is that you, as an expert and policy analyst for the Middle East, have job security for the foreseeable future.
I guess that's true. It's sort of soul-crushing to think that bad news is good for me personally, but it's right. That is the only good news I can think of coming from the Middle East these days.
You've just written a book called The End of Ambition. The subtitle is America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. If I were going to describe, and I just can't recommend this book strongly enough. I read a lot on the Middle East, and this is very clear, very straightforward, and not just descriptive, but prescriptive. And I just thought it was an excellent book. So before we dive into the current conflict, give us a little bit of your perspective from the negotiation history of the U.S. attempting to negotiate, a Palestinian separate state. Has that ever been in the cards? Did we ever make progress?
Yes and no. I think if you look at the first 30 years or 25 years of the relationship, the answer is decidedly no. President Truman recognized the provisional government of the state of Israel and then basically ignored it. President Eisenhower and the Cold Warriors in his administration were interested in confronting the Soviet Union in the Middle East, and that meant building relationships with Arab countries in the region. It wasn't really until President Kennedy, he referred to Israel as the U.S.-Israel relationship as special. He was the first president to do that. He was also the first president or the second one. Eisenhower sold some modest amount of weapons to Israel, but the first major weapon sales from the United States to Israel was during the Kennedy administration. There were Hawk missiles, which are defensive missiles, which actually the Israelis still have in storage. And there was some talk about them transferring them to Ukraine early on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In any event, the contours of the U.S.-Israel relationship that we know really goes back to first Kennedy and then certainly Lyndon Johnson, who said that, after Kennedy was assassinated, said to Israeli officials, if you think you had a friend in Kennedy, you have an even better friend in me, Lyndon Johnson. But yes, we have had this quote unquote special relationship, this strategic relationship based on a whole host of factors, politics, religion, moral commitments, based on, the history of the destruction of Jewry during World War II and strategic concerns. And one of the things that we have tried to do is forge peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And this was something that had been part of American foreign policy, but really became very, very important to American foreign policy in the 1990s. On the idea that the best way to help ensure Israeli security is by having a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with it. And we embarked upon that effort with tremendous amount of vigor in the 1990s through what was called the Oslo process. Now, actually, interestingly, the Oslo Accords were done without American input. This was secret negotiations between Palestinians and Israeli academics that became public in the summer of 1993 that the government of Israel endorsed and then the PLO endorsed. And that's when you get that famous handshake on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993 between Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton. That was an achievement. The PLO accepted Israel recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. And they embarked on a negotiation that those seem like such good days. I mean, there was an end date to this. By 1999, there was supposed to be a final conclusion to these negotiations that everybody assumed, without anybody spelling it out, would result in the establishment of a Palestinian state. Well, I could bore you with endless numbers of details, but the fact of the matter is that this idea, this peace process, was undermined by extremists. You had extremists on the Palestinian side who, in the mid-1990s, started bombing buses in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, killing large numbers of civilians. Then you had extremists on the Israeli side. The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by an Israeli extremist. You had a murder of Palestinians praying in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, which is also a very holy place for Jews. And you had, while all of this was going on, continued Israeli settlement activity, so that by the time the 1990s ended, you had double the number of settlers in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip than you did when the Oslo process began, leading Palestinians to wonder, hey, what did I get out of this? If the land that's supposed to be my state has been continued to be settled, are the Israelis very serious? And then the Israelis wondering, hey, the Palestinians are engaging in violence, and actually the Palestinian leadership is encouraging us in a variety of ways. So this all ended in a terrible, terrible way in late 2000 with the beginning of what's called the Second Intifada. And that came just as the negotiations between Israelis that President Clinton had overseen during his 8 years in office were collapsing. And unlike the first Intifada of the mid to late 1980s, which pitted Israeli soldiers against stone-throwing Palestinians, young Palestinians, this was really a dirty little war between armed factions of Palestinians and the Israeli army. And lots of people lost their lives. And then essentially the peace process has been dead since then.
I guess one thing that I've always taught, and just kind of correct me here if I've been teaching the wrong thing, is that both sides have been vulnerable to the extremists of the other side or their own extremists. And that being able to sabotage from one side or another has made it just very vulnerable. And each side's made that mistake to let the extremists drive the process. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, that has essentially been the story here. Extremists on each side sabotage the best laid plans of the moderates. And that's what's happened until, in fact, the extremists take over. And what we're seeing now with the Israeli government is those extremists, compatriots of the people of the guy who murdered Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, after a peace rally, are now ministers in the Israeli government. On the Palestinian side, the Palestinian Authority, which was set up by the Oslo process as the state in the making, is moribund, corrupt, compromised, illegitimate, and the most dynamic end of Palestinian politics, if not, not counting for the Palestinian diaspora, is Hamas. So you have this sort of terrible, terrible situation where both sides are dominated by one-staters. That is, the Israeli extremists don't see any place for a Palestinian state in the land between the river and the sea. And Hamas and its supporters don't see any place for Israel or Jews in the land between the river and the sea. And so this is what makes for this horrifying conflict that's been unfolding for 10 months. And importantly, why American policy has failed so tragically in getting a ceasefire. Neither side wants a ceasefire. They see this as a fight to the death, as an existential fight. And so, again, it's an assumption that American policymakers go into, and that we can forge a ceasefire, that just enough diplomatic pressure on the part of the United States will bring about a ceasefire, and that everybody actually will want a ceasefire. And that's certainly not the case.
Hasn't that been the case? If I look back at the past 4 or 5 presidents, each has had that assumption that I can, through force of will, political will, pressure, negotiate a Palestinian state. And I'm guessing you would just say they were all naive. It was never in the cards. It was a waste of time. All those efforts to negotiate were a waste of time.
You can see me laughing here, not because I think it's tragic, but yes, I think that we have essentially been barking up the wrong tree here. I don't think it was ever in the cards. I think that if you look at what the Israelis have done in the West Bank in particular, in terms of the settlements and the settlement infrastructure, and settlement is really a misnomer here. I mean, we're talking about towns and cities and infrastructure that is clearly permanent. And Palestinians have long believed that time is on their side, that in time, the number of Palestinians would outnumber the number of Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Israel would be forced into a host of extremely difficult situations, including the emergence of an apartheid state, which would delegitimize the state and eventually undermine it. So I don't think that there's really been a lot of goodwill and a lot of significant interest on part of political leaders and extremists in having two states living side by side in peace. That's not to suggest that there aren't millions of Israelis and Palestinians who want to get on with their lives, who want to end this terrible conflict, and who are willing to make the difficult compromises for peace. But those are people who don't have the political power. I mean, think about it in Israel. I mentioned the Palestinian Authority, which was, and of course, Israelis would debate you whether the Palestinian Authority really was genuinely interested in two-state. But let's stipulate that it does. The two parties that represent peace in Israel have together 4 seats in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, out of 120, whereas the extremists that I mentioned have 14 combined or 13 combined. We're in a very different era from the 1990s when there was a lot of hope, I think misplaced, but there was nevertheless a lot of hope.
So many things I'd like to ask you here. Let's dive into the comment you made about the settlements in the West Bank aren't really settlements. They're, permanent taking of land. If you look at a map today of the West Bank, it's sort of Swiss cheese with the holes are really the places occupied by the Palestinians. They don't have that much contiguous land. From a land war perspective, this is a war that the Israelis have essentially won. It's over. I think Gaza, the war there in terms of land, is over. Is it an oversimplification to say that, at least from a land perspective, this war is over and the Israelis have won?
Certainly, it's hard to imagine the Israelis withdrawing from the West Bank, particularly now after October 7th, but even before. I mean, I went out there as a 24-year-old in the summer of 1992, my first trip out to the West Bank, and it was a very, very different West Bank then. And I said, there's no way the Israelis are giving this up, even then. And from where, I could see the settlements that ring Jerusalem, and they were big. They weren't settlements. They were big towns. I mean, at that time, these are settlements called Ma'ale Adumim and another one called Kedumim. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, and these were towns that were on par with the suburb that I grew up in. So it was very, very clear to me. And I think a lot of American officials felt, well, if we could just get a two-state solution, these things wouldn't matter. We get a two-state solution, then we figured out the rest later. Yet it was clearly an intention to continue to settle the land. And even under kind of left of center or center governments in Israel, which there have been fewer and fewer of, but they had allowed the thickening of settlements because they didn't want to be attacked and brought down by the right. So they sort of gave them the opportunities to do this. And so I think, if you just look at what President Trump, for example, had, his peace plan was essentially institutionalizing this situation where you have archipelagos of Palestinian self-government in essentially Palestinian population centers. Ramallah, Bethlehem, Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarm. Hebron's a little bit different because of the small Jewish enclave within that city that is holy to both communities. In the Gaza Strip, the Israelis withdrew. They withdrew in 2005. When they withdrew in 2005, there were 7 crossings from the Gaza Strip into Israel, and there was a time when there was a negotiated safe passage between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is about 50 miles, separated by 50 miles of Israeli territory. Once the Palestinian Authority was defeated, not just in the ballot box, but on the battlefield in a short civil war between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, the Israelis were presented with a security problem because they were facing near constant rocket fire. And that's when they, in cooperation with the Egyptians, who are also afraid of Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the boogeyman for Egyptian officials, which they laid on this blockade that has been in place now for, I can't do the math, 17 years or so. And I think the real challenge now after this war, and we're talking about territory, is what's the disposition of the Gaza Strip? Who's going to rebuild it? And most importantly, and this is what I've been telling policymakers when I've had the opportunity to talk to them, is let's not assume that the Israelis aren't going to try to settle or resettle the Gaza Strip. And I'm not necessarily saying Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to, I'm not necessarily saying that his advisors want to, but that radical right who are part of his government and who make up a not insignificant number of the Israeli public very much wants to resettle the Gaza Strip. And under these circumstances, present circumstances, there's a real fear, at least on my part, that this would include ethnic cleansing. And that would undermine everything that the United States has been trying to do in the Middle East for the course of the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years or so.
Let's talk about American influence over Israel in a second. But before we get to that, from my perspective, a two-state solution is dead. 2/3 of the Israeli public is against it. Mm-hmm. The U.S. isn't going to push it. It's a terrible situation, but like all wars, there are winners and losers. And in this case, the Palestinians have lost in the land war, from my perspective. Give me your perspective on U.S. influence. We have for years tried to get the Israelis to slow down settlements in the West Bank. Almost each president has said that, but there's been no teeth in that. A lot of people in the U.S. feel like, gosh, with all this special relationship and aid we give Israel, we should have some influence. Cynically, you could say it's been paltry. What influence have we had? What influence could we have? And what should we be doing differently, assuming you agree that a two-state solution is dead?
Oh, I'm the hanging judge on the two-state solution in Washington. I mean, I've been saying this for a very, very long time, that the two-state solution was dead and that we really did need to think about alternatives. Once again, so as not to be surprised or caught flat-footed that, saying that the two-state solution was dead would be beneficial, but politically it was much more difficult to do that. And so no one was actually willing to say that because they didn't have a good plan. And the implications of saying that the two-state solution is dead were too difficult for people to accept because we didn't really have much that we could do about it. I mean, basically what it would say is the permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people and Israel becoming an apartheid state. I don't believe it's an apartheid state yet. If you look within the Green Line, it's certainly not the case, but there's clearly two regimes under which Israelis in the West Bank live and Palestinians in the West Bank live. And if that were to become one, you would clearly have an apartheid state. But having just traveled to South Africa, this is something that's actually different despite what people say about it.
I guess I'd push back a little bit there, having spent a bunch of time over there. If you look at Arabs, for example, living in Israel, it feels more apartheid-like than not to me. So you're more optimistic.
I've spent time in the Arab sector in Israel, in Al-Fahim and Kufr Qasim and so on and so forth. And it certainly, there is institutional discrimination in Israel without a doubt. A big part of it is that Arabs don't serve in the military. The military is this pipeline for, it's like the Ivy League in the United States. I'm not dismissing that at all. What I'm saying is that they don't live under a separate security regime. They once did up until 1966, I believe. Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under military occupation. They don't any longer. And there has been some successes and some not successes. Of course, this is a very significant problem at the heart of Israeli democracy, that Arab parties can't really participate in governing. The one time that they did, the government was brought down after a year by opponents who couldn't abide by the fact that there was an Arab party that was supporting the coalition. In any event, So it's a topic for another podcast.
Yeah.
You're asking about American influence.
Yeah.
I think American influence is largely limited. And we don't, and it's limited, one, in the sense that we're not willing to use whatever influence we imagine we might have. Part of that is we're not sure we do have that influence, right? And it's also one bullet in the chamber. If you say, if you do X, this will be the consequence, and the Israelis go ahead and do X and there's no consequence, and generally there isn't consequences. There's no red lines for any of our partners in the Middle East, if you think about it. But there's not a lot of American influence. We have half-heartedly put pressure on the Israelis about settlement activity, arguing that, once again, if you have a two-state solution, the settlement issue becomes easier to deal with without really owning up to the fact that the settlements are essentially there to prevent a two-state solution. And this has been a problem of political will, and that's part of what the issue is here in the United States, is that pro-Israel groups, Jewish groups, evangelicals, are well organized and are strong. The Jewish groups are more divided than the evangelical groups, and as I point out, the Democratic Party has varying views on Israel, whereas the Republican Party is pretty lockstep in support of Israel. And then when you kind of look at the overall polling in the country, more than half the country, 54% remains very supportive of Israel, which has historically been the case. Those numbers really haven't moved tremendously in years. And so being pro-Israel remains pretty popular. And so if that's the case, why would you want to exert influence on a partner and a friend, some country which you allegedly have a special relationship, that it just doesn't figure into the political calculations of people who are either appropriating money or carrying out policy? Whereas folks like myself and others can see what the problem is with basically the kinds of blank checks essentially the Israelis have had.
So if you were advising the administration, let's talk about just resettlement of Gaza. I agree that that's a real risk. Would you put any consequences for that out as the U.S. if the Israelis go in and start resettling Gaza? Or would you just turn a blind eye, as we've done in the past with the settlements in the West Bank?
I've been very forceful in my conversations when I've had the opportunity to talk to senior administration officials and said, forget some of these other things that you've been talking publicly about, reviving the Palestinian Authority. It's beyond revival. Forget talking about a two-state solution. 2/3 of Israelis are opposed to it, especially after October 7th. They can't imagine this idea. But one thing you can do is that, and because this will be extraordinarily detrimental to American goals in the region, is that you can put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Israelis. If you're going to do one thing and threaten them over one thing, it is resettlement of the Gaza Strip. And that I would pull out all the stops and say, you resettle the Gaza Strip, you're not getting military aid.
Interesting. I doubt we have the political will.
I would fire that one bullet in the gun on that issue, because it would undermine virtually everything that the United States wanted to do. I don't think a Palestinian state was ever in the cards, so I never thought that it was worth American presidential and others' political investment and their resources to do it. It just wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't necessarily a core interest of the United States. But this, you fundamentally reshape American, you would undermine American goals across the region, because we would be seen totally complicit in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people.
I guess I'm skeptical that that's politically viable. To stick with your metaphor of firing a gun, I might use a shotgun and take a broader approach. You talked earlier in the podcast about the way we decided how much aid would go to Egypt versus Israel was a little bit random rather than having objective criteria. I feel like with Israel, we need criteria. We need criteria for when we help them. And that should be policy, so that each time we're not saying, whether in the Gaza situation or any other, let's just keep giving them money independent of any consistency with our broader goals and policy. So to me, I'd use a shotgun. I'd come up with an objective criteria for when we give aid and for what thing. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think it's a reasonable perspective to have, is that, there should be some objective criteria across a range of issues. given the way the politics of this shakes itself out, a divided Democratic Party and a Republican Party that is kind of lockstep, it makes it hard to do that. But you're speaking my language. I mean, in my recent column in Foreign Policy magazine, I said, in a counterintuitive way, the best way to corral the Israelis is to actually have a security pact with them. President Biden went to Israel shortly after the horrifying Hamas massacres on October 7th. And what people always ask me, like, if you're sitting next to the president, what would you say? I would have said to the president, listen, if you want to go to Israel and express your solidarity, that's fine. Keep in mind, it's not necessarily going to buy you influence unless you start talking about how you'd like to see things shake out right then and there. Because the Israelis, for a variety of reasons, and I think, if you've seen the footage from October 7th, you'll understand the mindset there. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying you understand the mindset. The Israelis define this conflict in existential terms, and it's very, very hard to influence anybody who thinks that they're fighting for their lives. So it strikes me that from the beginning, from that very moment that Biden decided he would give a bear hug to the Israeli government, without at that moment sort of laying down markers, you were going to end up in the situation that we are right now, because the Israelis believe, and you read what Hamas said on October 7th. Their statement is deeply genocidal. You look at the footage, all of those things are absolutely 100% right. But if you wanted to be able to help manage the Israeli military operation so you didn't have this horrifying mess that you have right now with tens of thousands of people dead, the president needed to take a different approach. My own view is, look, a security pact is much better than not having one. Even though, some people say, oh, well, they might ignore it. At least you have something on paper. I'm an institutionalist. I think that the Israelis don't need the military aid that they've gotten over many years. It's time to phase it out and replace it with something else. A security pact, agreements on military and tech transfer, which, by the way, go both ways. So that makes for a healthier relationship, and it makes us actually less complicit with the Israelis. But I definitely think you're right. I mean, is there another country in the world that just gets like, well, I guess Egypt. I mean, they have a horrifying human rights record, and the administration after administration keeps overriding congressional concerns about this and keeps sending them the military aid. In any event, that's also the topic for another podcast, why there are no red lines.
Yeah. Anytime we do put a red line in place, I'm thinking of Obama in Syria. We never hold to it. I'm thinking of Ukraine. I mean, we're not very good at following up on red lines, so why don't we keep drawing them?
No red lines for our partners.
Yeah. I want to turn to the northern border. Let me just kind of summarize, and I think we're mostly in agreement in terms of Gaza and the West Bank. Each of us are pessimistic, not a lot of cause for hope. Is there any prescription? You've mentioned one thing, which is putting some teeth into if they resettle Gaza. Anything else you'd recommend to the administration in terms of what to do about West Bank and Gaza before we move to the northern border?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there's much that the United States can do in the West Bank and Gaza beyond the question of resettlement of Gaza. I mean, as you point out, and I agree, the West Bank is essentially lost. The Israelis have won there. They're determined to annex it. Even before this terrible government, there was this talk of economic peace or narrowing the conflict. And that was just basically an excuse to say, we want to do whatever we want, but we'll do stuff to improve the lives of Palestinians in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which was, putting lipstick on a pig. I don't think that there's much left for the United States to do. There were moments in the past when there was more that we could do. And we were, in the words of former American diplomat and peace processor Aaron David Miller, who's a friend of mine, we were too busy being Israel's lawyer to put teeth into anything. When it comes to the North, I mean, it's a different ball of wax here.
Can I frame that conversation by, the media's constantly talking about Hezbollah, but it's sort of a proxy for Iran. So we're really talking about Iran against Israel. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, Hezbollah is not a creation of Iran. It does come from Lebanese Shia society, but of course, Iran had a very significant role in its establishment, and its establishment as a very significant military force.
Let's just briefly give us an education on what Iranian interests are as they pertain to Israel and as they pertain to the U.S. in the region.
Well, Iran has two goals. One, to push the United States out of the region. And the second is the destruction of Israel. Iranian leaders have said over and over again that is their goal. And in particular, since October 7th, they've reiterated that Israel is a fleeting presence in the Middle East, that it's weak, and that everything that has happened since October 7th, kind of proves the point. Hezbollah has become an expeditionary force of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They've showed up to support Bashar al-Assad in Syria at the direction of the IRGC. They have trained and provided know-how to the Houthis in Yemen, as well as Hamas. Some of the things that Hamas did on October 7th were right out of the Hezbollah playbook. So there's that. The other piece I think the most important role that Hezbollah plays for Iran is that it is Iran's second strike capability. The Iranians have supplied Hezbollah either with or given them the ability to produce in the range of, estimates are 100 to 150,000 rockets, missiles, and precision munitions that could strike all over Israel. And this is something that has deterred the Israelis and the United States from striking Iran's nuclear facilities. And so that is the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran. It's grown tighter and more important over the course of the last 10 years. But it has, long been critical to Iran's regional interests and ability to influence Arab politics has been Hezbollah and the threat that it poses to Israel, as well as the threat that Hezbollah poses to, the Lebanese state. The Saudis supported the other side, the Sunnis in Lebanon. And the ability of the Iranians, with the assistance of Hezbollah, to build influence in Baghdad, Damascus, Lebanon, and now Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, has been a real strategic achievement for the Iranians.
We're running out of time. There's so many things to talk about. Let's end with, and I have an assumption that Republicans and Democrats have more in common in the foreign policy arena than in a lot of other arenas. The Trump administration clearly has, both during the Trump administration and prospectively, sort of threatened to move back to kind of a 1930s, 1940s style of isolationism, protectionism. How can we come together? How can the parties come together on foreign policy? Any prescription there?
It's interesting because there's always been much more continuity in U.S. foreign policy. I think with Trump, that's no longer the case. And one of the things that our partners in the region complain about is that there have been these 180-degree turns. We had a JCPOA, then we're out of the JCPOA, then President Biden wants to get back in it. And they just don't know what it is. We're promoting democracy. We're not promoting democracy. I think there is significant domestic political divides that are now being played out in our foreign policy. And I don't have a lot of hope that we will have more continuity in our foreign policy, regardless of who it is. I think that given our deep polarization, political divides, I think we have red team foreign policy, blue team foreign policy, and not enough red, white, and blue foreign policy. I think people, they criticize the uniparty and the continuity, but I think it served the United States well to have more consensus on foreign policy than we did. I'm not saying we should continue the same policies over and over again, but the bipartisan consensus that has existed over many years on foreign policy served us well. I mean, just separate from the Middle East and the contentious and emotional nature of debates on the Middle East. Just look at Ukraine. I mean, we have significant parts of the Republican Party that, is openly supportive of Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's not good for a core global interest of the United States, which is a Europe that is prosperous, whole, democratic, and free. And so I don't see the transformative figure in American politics that's going to bring us back to a point where we can agree on things, or we can disagree in a way that we still get to a place that is what's best for the country, that at least we think is best for the country. But currently what's happening now is there's just so much pressure to do, anything but what Bush did, anything but what Obama did, anything but what Trump did, and everything becomes a kind of political, cultural battle, including our foreign policy. So I'm deeply, deeply pessimistic about it.
I guess one thing I've been thinking about in your book, you articulately, and again, just a strong plug for this book, which, The End of Ambition, everyone should get it. You talk about the hedge. You have a chapter about this, and that countries in the Middle East are starting to hedge their bets because the U.S. isn't reliable. So place for China to enter, place for Russia to enter. How big a risk is that in the Middle East? And again, we could do a whole podcast on this, but how real are those risks? And is that part of the reason we should stay in the Middle East and not retrench?
Well, if one of our goals in the world is to confront an ambitious China that wants to remake the rules of the road globally, then we certainly want to be in the Middle East because the Chinese are there and they're trying to do and influence the region and remake the rules there. And now they're not going to get kicked out of the Middle East. There's too many takers for, Chinese investment and projects and so on and so forth. But, and indeed, the Chinese share some of our interests in the region, the free flow of energy resources and freedom of navigation. At the same time, when we talk about leaving, when we talk about retrenching, when we talk about pivoting to Asia, when we do things that instill in the minds of leaders in the region that our word about security and stability in the region are not good, like when the Iranians attacked Saudi Arabia in September 2019 and bombed 2 oil facilities there. And President Trump said, yeah, they attacked Saudi Arabia, not us. We're not going to do anything. And Democrats actually applauded that. Then they say, look, no one can replace the United States, at least not yet. But there are at least other options. And we're going to seek to develop our relations with both the Chinese and the Russians as a result.
So summarize your thoughts in just some closing comments about how much we should care about the Middle East. We're collectively very pessimistic about Israel-Palestine. We didn't get a chance to talk about the complexity of Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I mean, when you really look at this region, North Africa, whether it's the desertification, political conflict in North Africa, across the Levant, into the Gulf, you and I could probably brainstorm right here 25 conflicts just based on land. And then if we added politics and we added religion and we added climate change, it's a mess. So how strongly...
You're depressing me.
Well, you've got job security, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. But, the pivot to Asia, I think, was for a reason. And part of that reason was we're not making any progress in the Middle East and we're not getting much out of it. How strongly should we be there? And anything you'd recommend that we do differently to summarize?
Well, look, if you look at the map, look at the United States and then scan across the map to China, what's literally in the middle? The Middle East. And it's critical. It's a critical area where our world energy flows back and forth, ideas flow back and forth. It is an important region. I think the pivot to Asia was a response to this period of failure in the region. But like I said, I think part of it was a retrenchment and almost a withdrawal. And I think that that's too radical a solution. What I argue in my book, and thank you again for mentioning it, it means a lot to me, is that there is a place for us in the region. We just need to understand what's actually important to us in the region and devote resources to those things that are important to us. That way we can be much more constructive both in the region as well as achieve goals that are outside the region, like outmaneuvering the Chinese, if we agree that that's something that we want to do. You can't just write off the region. There's a way to be there. And I hate to use there's a smarter way to be there. I mean, people have said that, but there are ways in which we have lost our way because we believe everything and anything was important to us there. Things that are laudable, building a Palestinian state, freedom and democracy, literacy, all of those things are things that I think are incredibly important and laudable and come from a good place from American policymakers. But some of those things are not either realistic or things that we can do. We can't remake other people's societies.
That's a great place to end. I got to about half of what I wanted to get to. It's a rich topic, and
I'm happy to come back.
Yeah, no, we'd love to do a part 2. Stephen, where can people find you online? Obviously, we'll put a link to your book in the notes, but if they want to follow you, and I think a lot of people will after this conversation, where can they find you?
Well, thanks. You can find me at cfr.org, Council on Foreign Relations website, and I am on X or Twitter or Twix or whatever you call it, at Stephen A. Cook.
All right. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Stan.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.